The morning sun cast long shadows across Oakwood Drive as David Johnson pulled into his driveway, for what felt like the 100th time in 3 weeks. Each time he came home to this house, he still couldn't quite believe it was his. After years of working his way up through the ranks of federal law enforcement, he'd finally made it to a position where he could afford a place like this. The house sat on a corner lot in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. It was a classic 2-story colonial with white columns and black shutters, surrounded by mature oak trees that gave the street its name. The circular driveway was one of the features that had sold him on the property. As someone who often worked late hours and dealt with sensitive cases, having a private entrance felt like a necessity rather than a luxury. David stepped out of his black SUV and stretched his back. At 42, he was in excellent shape, but the long hours at his desk were starting to catch up with him. 3 weeks ago, he'd been appointed as the new field office chief for the FBI's regional division. It was a promotion he'd worked toward for 15 years, and it came with responsibilities he was still getting used to. The move to Oakwood Drive had been strategic. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with professionals who minded their own business. It was also close enough to the federal building that he could be at work in 20 minutes, even during rush hour. Most importantly, it offered the kind of security and privacy that someone in his position needed. He grabbed a toolbox from the back of his SUV and walked toward the front of his driveway. Today was Saturday, and he'd finally found time to install the automatic gate system he'd been planning since he moved in. The contractors had done most of the heavy work during the week, installing the posts and running the electrical lines. All that was left was connecting the control panel and testing the sensors. David had always been hands-on with projects like this. Growing up, his father had taught him that if you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. Plus, working with his hands helped him think through complex cases. There was something therapeutic about focusing on concrete problems with clear solutions, especially after spending his days dealing with investigations that could drag on for months or years. He changed into old jeans and a faded gray t-shirt, then gathered his tools and headed back outside. The gate itself was already in place, a tasteful black iron design that matched the style of the neighborhood. The control box needed to be mounted and programmed, and the safety sensors required precise positioning to ensure the gate wouldn't close on a car or person. As he worked, David thought about how different this neighborhood was from where he'd grown up. He'd been raised in a working-class area across town, where his mother worked double shifts as a nurse and his father drove a delivery truck. They'd instilled in him the values of hard work and education, always telling him that in America, you could achieve anything if you were willing to put in the effort. His parents had been right, but they hadn't prepared him for some of the challenges he'd face along the way. Being one of the few black agents in his field office had meant proving himself over and over again. Every promotion had come with whispers that he'd received special treatment. Every mistake was scrutinized more closely than those of his colleagues. But he'd persevered, building a reputation for thorough investigations and strong leadership. The control panel was more complex than he'd expected. David pulled out the instruction manual and spread it across the hood of his car. The wiring diagram looked like something out of an engineering textbook, with multiple colored wires that needed to be connected in a specific sequence. He'd tackled more complicated projects before, but this one required patience. Across the street, he noticed movement in one of the windows. A middle-aged woman was watching him from behind her curtains. He'd seen her a few times since moving in, but hadn't had a chance to introduce himself. The previous owner had mentioned that she'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and knew everyone on the block. David made a mental note to go over and introduce himself once he finished with the gate. Building good relationships with neighbors was important, especially in his line of work. The last thing he needed was complaints about late-night arrivals or the occasional unmarked car parked in his driveway. He turned his attention back to the control panel. The first step was connecting the power supply, which meant turning off the electricity to that section of the house. David walked to the side of his garage where the electrical panel was located.
He'd studied the layout carefully when he first moved in,
labeling each circuit breaker so he'd know exactly what controlled what. After flipping the appropriate breaker, he returned to the gate and began connecting the wires. Red to positive, black to negative, green for ground. The manual emphasized the importance of making secure connections, warning that loose wires could cause the system to malfunction or even pose a safety hazard. The work was methodical and satisfying. Each connection brought him closer to having a fully functional security system. The gate would be controlled by a remote in his car and a keypad mounted on a post near the street. Visitors could call his house phone through an intercom system, and he could open the gate from inside. As he worked, David reflected on why security had become so important to him. In his current position, he oversaw investigations into organized crime, terrorism, and white-collar fraud. Some of these cases involved dangerous individuals who wouldn't hesitate to target law enforcement officers or their families. While he wasn't married and didn't have children, he still needed to be careful about who knew where he lived. The sensor installation required him to lie on the ground and crawl partially under the gate mechanism. It was dirty work, and by the time he emerged, his clothes were covered in dust and grease stains. But the sensors were crucial for safety. They would detect if a car was in the path of the gate and prevent it from closing until the way was clear. David stood up and brushed off his clothes, then walked back to his car to test the remote control. He pressed the button and held his breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft mechanical hum, the gate began to move. It swung open smoothly and stopped at exactly the right position. He pressed the button again, and the gate closed with the same smooth precision. The sensors were working perfectly, stopping the gate when he waved his hand in front of them and resuming operation when the path was clear. Standing back to admire his work, David felt a sense of accomplishment. The gate looked professional and welcoming, not like the fortress-style barriers he'd seen at some Linda Patterson had lived on Oakwood Drive for 12 years. And in all that time, she'd never seen anything like what was happening across the street. From her kitchen window, she watched as a black man in dirty work clothes tinkered with the gate at the Morrison house. The Morrisons had moved to Florida 6 months ago, and the house had been sold quickly to someone she'd never met. She knew for certain that whoever bought the Morrison place wouldn't be doing manual labor on their own property. People in this neighborhood hired professionals for that kind of work. The man across the street was clearly up to no good, probably trying to break into the house or steal something valuable. Linda had seen enough crime shows to know how these things worked. Thieves often dressed like workers or delivery people to avoid suspicion. They'd scout a property for days, learning the routines of the neighborhood before making their move. This man had been there for over an hour, long enough to disable security systems or figure out how to get inside. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts, looking for the number of Janet Wu, who lived 2 houses down. Janet was the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator and would know what to do about this situation. But before she could make the call, she saw the man test what looked like a remote control, and the gate actually opened and closed. That confirmed her suspicions. He wasn't just vandalizing the property, he was stealing the entire gate system, probably planning to come back later with a truck to haul it away. Linda had heard about crews that specialized in stealing expensive outdoor equipment from vacant homes. Gates, fountains, even mature trees had been targeted in other neighborhoods. She couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. The Oakwood Drive residents had worked hard to maintain their property values and keep crime out of their area. If word got out that thieves could operate openly in broad daylight, it would encourage more criminal activity. Linda slipped on her shoes and checked her appearance in the hallway mirror. She wanted to look authoritative when she confronted this criminal. At 55, she was a retired school principal who had dealt with troublemakers for 30 years. She knew how to project authority and wasn't easily intimidated. She grabbed her phone and headed across the street, her mind racing with what she would say. The key was to let him know that someone was watching and that his criminal activity had been noticed. Often that was enough to scare off thieves who preferred to work unobserved. As she got closer, she could see that the man was taller than she'd realized, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested he worked out regularly. But Linda wasn't going to be intimidated by his size. Right was on her side, and she had the law to back her up. The man was bent over a toolbox organizing his equipment. He was definitely preparing to leave, probably planning to come back later with an accomplice in a truck. Linda needed to act fast before he disappeared and the trail went cold. "Excuse me?" she called out in her most authoritative voice. "I need to speak with you right now." The man looked up and Linda got her first clear look at his face. He appeared to be in his 40s with short cropped hair and intelligent eyes. For a moment she almost wavered in her conviction. He didn't look like the drug addicts and desperate criminals she'd seen on the news. But she reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. "Good morning," the man said pleasantly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" His casual attitude only confirmed Linda's suspicions. A legitimate worker would be more deferential when questioned by a neighborhood resident. This man's confidence suggested he was experienced at talking his way out of trouble. "Don't try to charm me," Linda said firmly. "I've been watching you for over an hour, and I know exactly what you're doing here." The man straightened up and faced her directly. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm David Johnson, and I own this house. I was just installing a security gate." Linda almost laughed at the audacity of his lie. "Oh, please. Do you really think I'm that gullible? I know the people who live in this neighborhood, and you are definitely not one of them." She pulled out her phone and held it up so he could see she was ready to record everything. "I'm documenting this entire conversation, so don't even think about trying to intimidate me or make up more stories." David raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Ma'am, I understand why you might be concerned about someone you don't recognize working on a property, but I really do live here. I moved in 3 weeks ago. Maybe we just haven't had a chance to meet yet." 3 weeks ago? Linda's voice rose with indignation. "I would have noticed if someone moved into the Morrison house. I keep track of everything that happens on this street." The truth was, Linda had been visiting her sister in Phoenix for most of the past month and had only returned a few days ago. But she wasn't about to admit that to this criminal. It would only encourage him to think he could lie to her. "Look," David said patiently, "I can show you the deed to the property if that would help clear this up, or we could call the real estate agent who handled the sale. Her name is Rebecca Torres, and she works for Prestige Properties downtown." Linda had heard of Rebecca Torres and even knew she was legitimate, but that just proved how sophisticated this criminal was. He'd done his homework, learning the names of local real estate agents to make his story sound convincing. Professional thieves often went to great lengths to create believable cover stories. "I'm not falling for your smooth talk," Linda said, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You can save your lies for the police because that's who I'm calling right now." She started to dial 911, but David stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, please don't do that. There's really no need to involve law enforcement in what's obviously just a misunderstanding between neighbors." Linda stepped back, alarmed by his movement. "Stay right where you are. Don't come any closer, or I'm telling them you threatened me." "I didn't threaten you," David said, his voice still calm but with an edge of frustration creeping in. "I'm just trying to prevent an unnecessary situation that's going to waste everyone's time." But Linda was already committed to her course of action. In her mind, his attempt to dissuade her from calling the police only proved his guilt. An innocent person would welcome police involvement to clear up the confusion. "Mia 1, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was crisp and professional. "Yes, I need to report a burglary in progress," Linda said, keeping her eyes fixed on David. "There's a man at 1247 Oakwood Drive who's been tampering with a security gate and claiming he owns the property. But I know he's lying." David shook his head and returned to organizing his tools. He'd encountered this type of situation before, though never at his own home. Some people saw a black man in a nice neighborhood and immediately assumed he didn't belong there. It was frustrating and demeaning, but he'd learned that staying calm was the best strategy. The dispatcher asked for more details, and Linda was happy to provide them. "He's a black male, probably in his 40s, about 6 feet tall. He's been here for over an hour working on this gate system, and when I confronted him, he started making up stories about owning the house." She paused, watching as David continued to pack up his tools with infuriating casualness. "He's acting very suspicious, and I think he might be getting ready to leave. You need to send someone right away before he escapes." David could hear most of the conversation, and he sighed deeply. He'd hoped to spend his Saturday relaxing and working on his new home. Instead, he was about to deal with a police response based on a neighbor's racial assumptions. It wasn't the first time, and unfortunately, it probably wouldn't be the last. "Ma'am, can you describe what the person was doing specifically?" the dispatcher asked. "He was installing some kind of electronic device on the gate," Linda reported. "He had tools and was connecting wires. Then he tested it with a remote control to make sure it worked. Obviously, he's either trying to steal the gate system or modify it so he can break into the house later." Linda glanced around the neighborhood, hoping some of her other neighbors were watching. It was important for everyone to see that she was taking action against criminal activity. If word spread that the Oakwood Drive residents wouldn't tolerate crime, it would help protect everyone's property values. The officers are on their way, the dispatcher informed her. Please stay on the line and keep the suspect in sight, but don't approach him or try to detain him yourself. Oh, don't worry about that, Linda said. I'm keeping my distance. He's been trying to convince me he lives here, but I'm not buying it. People in this neighborhood don't do their own manual labor. David overheard that comment and couldn't help but shake his head again. The assumption that successful black people couldn't possibly enjoy working with their hands was just another layer of the stereotyping he faced regularly. Some of his most relaxing moments came from tackling home improvement projects. He pulled out his driver's license and house keys, knowing the police would want to see identification and proof of residency. He also grabbed his federal credentials from the glove compartment of his car. Hopefully, the responding officers would be professional and would resolve the situation quickly. As they waited for the police to arrive, Linda continued to monitor David's movements while maintaining her phone conversation with the dispatcher. She was proud of herself for taking action and protecting her neighborhood. This was exactly the kind of vigilance that kept property values high and families safe. She had no idea that she was about to face the most embarrassing moment of her life, or that her actions would soon become a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on racial prejudice. Government officials' homes. It struck the right balance between security and neighborhood aesthetics. He was gathering his tools when he noticed the woman from across the street had come outside. She was standing on her front porch, no longer trying to hide the fact that she was watching him. Their eyes met for a moment, and David raised his hand in a friendly wave. The woman didn't wave back. Instead, she turned and went back inside her house, closing the door firmly behind her. David shrugged it off. Some people were just shy or preferred to keep to themselves. He'd give her time to get used to having a new neighbor. Little did he know that this woman had been watching him with growing suspicion for the past hour. In her mind, she was witnessing something that didn't make sense, and she was about to take action that would change both of their lives forever. The 911 dispatcher, Patricia Coleman, had been taking emergency calls for 8 years. In that time, she'd heard every type of crisis imaginable, from genuine life-threatening emergencies to complaints about neighbors playing music too loud. She developed a keen sense for distinguishing between real emergencies and situations that might be based on misunderstandings or personal conflicts, as Linda Patterson continued describing the situation on Oakwood Drive. Patricia found herself asking probing questions to better understand what was really happening. The caller seemed genuinely convinced that she was witnessing criminal activity, but some details didn't quite add up. Ma'am, you mentioned that this person has been working on the gate for about an hour, Patricia said. Did you see him arrive at the property? Was he driving a vehicle? Linda glanced toward David's black SUV parked in the driveway. Yes, he's got a big black truck or something parked right there in the driveway. It looks expensive, which is probably how he can afford all those professional tools. That detail caught Patricia's attention. In her experience, burglars and vandals typically used older, less conspicuous vehicles, often stolen ones that they could abandon quickly if necessary. They also rarely spent an hour working methodically on a single location in broad daylight. Can you see a license plate on the vehicle? Patricia asked. Linda squinted toward the SUV but couldn't make out the details from her current position. I can see there's a plate, but I can't read it from here. Look, I don't understand why you're asking so many questions. I'm telling you there's a crime in progress right here. Patricia continued typing notes into her computer system. I'm gathering all the information our officers will need, ma'am. You mentioned that when you spoke to this person, he claimed to own the property. Did he provide any documentation or evidence to support that claim? He offered to show me some papers, Linda admitted, but obviously those would just be forgeries. Criminals always come prepared with fake documents. I watch enough crime shows to know how these scams work. David, still within earshot of the conversation, was growing increasingly frustrated. He'd tried to be patient and understanding, recognizing that Linda might genuinely believe she was protecting her neighborhood. But her refusal to even consider that she might be wrong was making the situation worse with every passing minute. He decided to try one more time to resolve things peacefully. Walking closer to where Linda stood, he called out, Ma'am, I really think we can clear this up without involving the police. Why don't I show you my driver's license and the house deed? I've got everything right here in my car. Linda immediately backed away and spoke louder into her phone. "He's approaching me again. I told him to stay back, but he's not listening. This is exactly the kind of aggressive behavior I was talking about." Patricia heard the exchange through the phone and made additional notes. The alleged suspect was attempting to provide identification, which wasn't typical behavior for someone engaged in criminal activity, but she also had to take seriously any report of threatening behavior. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the situation and wait for officers to arrive," Patricia instructed. "Don't engage with this person anymore. Just observe from a safe distance." Linda walked back toward her own house, maintaining visual contact with David while staying on the phone with dispatch. She felt vindicated that the 911 operator was taking her concerns seriously and sending police to handle the situation. "How long before they get here?" Linda asked. "I'm worried he might try to leave before you can arrest him. Officers are en route and should arrive within the next few minutes," Patricia assured her. "In the meantime, can you tell me more about what specifically made you suspicious? You mentioned he was working on a gate?" Linda looked back toward David, who had returned to his vehicle and was sitting on the tailgate, apparently waiting for the police to arrive. He was installing some kind of electronic system on the gate, had all sorts of wires and tools spread out. When I first saw him, he was lying on the ground under the gate mechanism doing something with the sensors. Patricia found this description puzzling. Did it appear that he was trying to break or damage the gate system? "Well, no," Linda said slowly. "It looked more like he was installing it or fixing it. But that's exactly my point. Why would a burglar be improving someone else's security system? He's obviously planning to come back later, and he wants to make sure he can get in and out without being detected." The logic of Linda's theory was becoming increasingly convoluted, and Patricia was beginning to suspect this might be one of those calls that would be resolved with an embarrassed apology once the facts were clarified. But she had to follow protocol and ensure officers were dispatched to investigate any reported crime. David pulled out his cell phone and called his partner at the FBI field office. Agent Tom Rodriguez had been his colleague for 6 years and was one of the few people who knew about David's new address. "Tom, it's David. I've got a situation here at my house. A neighbor called the cops on me for working on my own gate." "Yeah, I know how it sounds." "No, I'm fine. But I could use a witness who can verify my identity when the local police arrive." Tom was familiar with David's experiences with racial profiling and understood immediately what was happening. "I can be there in 15 minutes. Don't do anything to escalate the situation. Just wait for backup." As David ended his call, he noticed that Linda was staring at him with renewed suspicion. In her mind, his phone call confirmed that he was coordinating with accomplices. Professional criminals always worked in teams, and he was probably calling for backup in case the police gave him trouble. "Dispatcher, he just made a phone call," Linda reported urgently. "He's probably calling his crew to warn them that police are coming. You need to get here faster before this turns into a bigger situation." Patricia made a note about the phone call but was becoming increasingly skeptical about Linda's interpretation of events. Everything the caller described could be explained by the simple fact that an innocent person was working on his own property and trying to resolve a misunderstanding. "Ma'am, I want you to listen carefully," Patricia said. "When the officers arrive, I need you to let them handle the situation. Don't try to detain or confront this person yourself. Is that understood?" "Of course I understand," Linda replied, slightly offended by the implication that she might interfere with police work. "I'm just trying to be a good neighbor and protect our community." 2 police cars were now approaching Oakwood Drive, their sirens silent, but emergency lights flashing. Patricia could hear them in the background of Linda's call. "Ma'am, the officers are arriving now. Please stay on the line until they've made contact with you." Officer Michael Chen was driving the lead vehicle, with his partner, Officer Lisa Rodriguez, in the passenger seat. They'd been patrolling the sector for 3 years and were familiar with the Oakwood Drive neighborhood. It was generally a quiet area with few service calls, mostly noise complaints or minor traffic violations. As they pulled onto the street, Chen immediately spotted the situation. A middle-aged white woman was standing on the sidewalk, phone to her ear, pointing toward a black man sitting by an expensive-looking SUV in a residential driveway. The man appeared calm and was making no attempt to leave the scene. "This doesn't look like a typical burglary call," Rodriguez observed. "The suspect isn't acting like someone who's been caught in the act of committing a crime." Chen nodded. "Let's approach this carefully and get both sides of the story before we make any assumptions." They parked their patrol car at the curb and approached Linda first, since she was the complainant. She immediately launched into a detailed explanation of everything she'd witnessed, emphasizing her certainty that criminal activity was taking place. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Linda said, ending her call with dispatch. "I've been watching this man for over an hour, and I'm absolutely certain he doesn't belong in this neighborhood. He's been tampering with that gate system, probably trying to steal it or modify it for a future break-in." Officer Rodriguez listened politely while taking notes. "Ma'am, did you witness this person actually damage anything or attempt to enter the house?" "Well, no, but that's not the point," Linda insisted. "He was clearly casing the property and working on the security system. When I confronted him about it, he tried to tell me he owned the house, which is obviously a lie." Chen looked toward David, who remained seated by his vehicle, hands visible and posture relaxed. Everything about the man's body language suggested someone who was waiting patiently for the situation to be resolved, not someone who was planning to flee or resist arrest. "We'll need to speak with him and verify his story," Chen told Linda. "Please wait here while we investigate." As the officers walked toward David, Linda felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, someone with authority was taking her concerns seriously. She was confident that once they questioned this criminal properly, his story would fall apart and his true intentions would be revealed. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, she would learn a lesson about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and that her actions would soon become neighborhood gossip that would follow her for years to come. Officer Michael Chen had been a patrol officer for 7 years, and he'd learned to read situations quickly. As he and his partner Lisa Rodriguez approached the man sitting by the black SUV, several things struck him as unusual for a typical burglary call. The suspect wasn't nervous or evasive. His tools were organized neatly, not scattered around like someone who'd been caught in the act. Most importantly, he was still at the scene more than an hour after allegedly committing a crime. David stood up as the officers approached, keeping his hands visible and moving slowly. He'd been through enough police encounters to know that sudden movements could escalate situations unnecessarily, especially when racial tensions were already involved. "Good afternoon, officers," David said calmly.
"I'm David Johnson, and I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my presence here." Chen noticed immediately that the man's speech was educated and professional.
His clothes were dirty from work, but they were good quality. The SUV behind him was a late-model vehicle in excellent condition, not the type typically associated with criminal activity. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity at this location," Officer Rodriguez said. "The complainant believes you've been tampering with property that doesn't belong to you."
"Can you help us understand what's going on?"
David nodded and reached slowly into his back pocket. "I can absolutely clear this up. This is my house, and I was installing a security gate system. I have identification and documentation right here." He handed over his driver's license, which clearly showed his name and the Oakwood Drive address. Rodriguez examined it carefully while Chen observed David's demeanor. Everything about the man suggested honesty and cooperation. "The address matches," Rodriguez told her partner. "Mr. Johnson, how long have you lived at this address?" "I moved in 3 weeks ago," David replied. "I bought the house from the Morrison family who relocated to Florida. The sale was handled by Rebecca Torres at Prestige Properties downtown." Chen was starting to get a clearer picture of what had happened. "And you were working on this gate system today?" "Yes, sir. I had contractors install the main components during the week, but I wanted to handle the final connections and programming myself. I enjoy working with my hands, and it helps me relax after long days at the office." Rodriguez looked toward Linda, who was standing about 50 feet away, watching their interaction intently. "Sir, the complainant seems very certain that you don't belong in this neighborhood. Have you had any previous interactions with her?" David shook his head. "I've seen her around, but haven't had a chance to introduce myself yet. When she approached me earlier, I tried to explain who I was and even offered to show her documentation, but she seemed convinced I was lying." "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Johnson?" Chen asked. "I'm in federal law enforcement," David replied. "I was recently promoted to field office chief for the FBI's regional division." Both officers exchanged glances. This detail completely changed the nature of the situation. Rodriguez pulled out her radio and called their dispatcher to run David's name through the federal law enforcement database. "Central, This is Unit 47. Can you run a David Johnson through the federal LEO database? Date of birth. She read the information from his driver's license. While they waited for confirmation, Chen continued the conversation. Sir, you mentioned you have documentation about the house purchase? Absolutely. David walked to his SUV and retrieved a folder from the glove compartment. Here's the deed, the sales contract, and the homeowner's insurance policy. Everything shows my name and this address. Rodriguez examined the documents while her radio crackled to life. Unit 47. Your subject, David Johnson, shows active status as FBI Field Office Chief, Regional Division. No wants or warrants. Clean record. The revelation hit both officers simultaneously. They were dealing with a senior federal law enforcement official who had been reported as a burglar for working on his own property. Chen felt a mixture of embarrassment and frustration at the situation. Mr. Johnson, I need to apologize for this situation, Chen said. It appears there's been a significant misunderstanding. David appreciated the officer's professionalism. I understand you were just doing your job based on the information you received. But I have to say, this isn't the first time I've been questioned about my presence in a place where someone assumed I didn't belong. Rodriguez looked back toward Linda, who was still watching expectantly. Sir, would you like us to explain the situation to the complainant? I think that might be helpful, David said. Maybe she'll be more receptive to hearing it from law enforcement. As the three men walked toward Linda, she felt a surge of anticipation. Surely the officers had gotten a full confession by now and were preparing to make an arrest. She'd been right to trust her instincts about this suspicious character. Ma'am, Officer Chen began, we've completed our investigation, and I need to inform you that Mr. Johnson is the legitimate owner of this property. Linda's face showed confusion rather than understanding. What do you mean? Did he show you forged documents? No, ma'am. We've verified his identity through multiple sources. Mr. Johnson purchased this house 3 weeks ago and was installing a security system on his own property. There's been no criminal activity here. The words didn't seem to register immediately. Linda looked back and forth between the officers and David, trying to process information that contradicted everything she'd believed for the past 2 hours. But that's impossible, she said slowly. I know this neighborhood. I would have known if someone new moved in. Officer Rodriguez spoke gently but firmly. Ma'am, Mr. Johnson is also a federal law enforcement officer. He's the FBI Field Office Chief for this region. You've essentially called the police on one of the senior law enforcement officials in the city. The color drained from Linda's face as the full implications of her mistake became clear. She'd spent 2 hours convinced she was witnessing criminal activity, had made accusations of theft and vandalism, and had insisted that a respected federal official was lying about his identity. I don't understand, Linda stammered. He was dressed like a worker. He had tools and was getting dirty. People in this neighborhood don't do that kind of work themselves. David stepped forward, his expression more sad than angry. Ma'am, there's no law that says successful people can't enjoy working on their own homes. I've been doing projects like this since I was a teenager. It's one of my favorite ways to spend a Saturday. Linda felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. Everything she'd interpreted as suspicious had been completely innocent. The professional tools, the methodical work, the expensive vehicle, it all made perfect sense now. She'd let her assumptions about who belonged in her neighborhood cloud her judgment completely. Mr. Johnson, I owe you a sincere apology, Linda said quietly. I genuinely thought I was protecting our community, but I realize now that I made terrible assumptions. David nodded but didn't immediately respond. He was thinking about how this incident reflected larger problems in society, where people of color were often viewed with suspicion, regardless of their achievements or status. Officer Chen addressed Linda directly. Ma'am, I need you to understand that filing false police reports is a serious matter. While we believe your call was made in good faith based on a misunderstanding, this situation could have escalated in dangerous ways. Linda nodded, feeling smaller with each passing moment. Is Mr. Johnson going to press charges against me? David had been considering that very question. He had every right to file a complaint for harassment and filing a false report. The incident had cost him his Saturday, embarrassed him in his new neighborhood, and perpetuated harmful stereotypes. But he also recognized an opportunity to educate rather than simply punish. I'm not interested in pursuing legal action, David said finally. But I do hope this experience helps you understand how assumptions based on someone's appearance can lead to serious mistakes. Linda felt a mixture of relief and continued embarrassment. Thank you for being so understanding. I promise this will never happen again. Agent Tom Rodriguez arrived just as the police were finishing their report. He'd raced across town when David called, expecting to find his partner in a potentially dangerous confrontation. Instead, he found him calmly discussing the situation with local officers who were clearly embarrassed about the entire incident. "Everything okay here?" Tom asked, his FBI credentials clearly visible. "Just a case of mistaken identity," David replied. Officer Chen and Officer Rodriguez handled it very professionally. Tom shook hands with both local officers. "Dave's one of the good guys. I'm glad you were able to sort this out quickly." As the police officers returned to their patrol car, Linda found herself standing alone with David and Tom. The neighborhood that had felt so familiar and safe just hours ago now seemed different somehow. She realized that her assumptions about who belonged there had been challenged in a way that would forever change how she viewed her community. "Mr. Johnson," she said hesitantly, "would it be appropriate for me to introduce you to some of the other neighbors? I think they'd like to meet you properly." David considered the offer. He wasn't sure he was ready to socialize with people who might share Linda's initial assumptions about him. But he also recognized that building relationships was important for long-term community harmony. "Maybe in a few weeks," he said diplomatically. "I think we all need some time to process what happened here today." As Linda walked back to her house, she knew that word of her mistake would spread through the neighborhood quickly. She'd gone from being the vigilant neighbor who protected everyone's safety to the person who had embarrassed the entire community. With her racial profiling, the hardest part was admitting to herself that David had been right. Her assumptions hadn't been based on legitimate security concerns, but on her unconscious biases about who belonged in her neighborhood and what successful people looked like. This was a lesson she would never forget, and one that would fundamentally change how she interacted with people who didn't look like her longtime neighbors. The news of Linda Patterson's mistake spread through the Oakwood Drive neighborhood with the speed of wildfire. By Sunday evening, nearly every resident within a 3-block radius had heard some version of the story about how their neighbor had called the police on the new FBI field office chief for working on his own gate. Janet Wu, the unofficial neighborhood coordinator, was among the first to learn the details. She lived 2 houses down from Linda and had witnessed the police cars arriving Saturday afternoon. When she called Linda Sunday morning to check on the situation, she was shocked to hear the full story. "Linda, I can't believe this happened," Janet said, trying to keep judgment out of her voice. "David Johnson seems like such a nice man. I met him at the grocery store last week and he was incredibly polite." Linda felt her stomach drop. "You met him? Why didn't you tell me someone new had moved in?" "I thought everyone knew," Janet replied. "The Morrisons mentioned they'd sold to a federal employee. I just assumed word had gotten around." That detail made Linda's mistake even more painful. If she'd simply asked around or introduced herself like a normal neighbor, the entire incident could have been avoided. Instead, she'd jumped to conclusions based on her own biases and created a situation that embarrassed everyone involved. By Monday morning, the story had reached David's workplace. Agent Tom Rodriguez had mentioned it to a few colleagues, and word spread quickly through the federal building. Most of David's subordinates and peers were supportive, expressing frustration that he'd had to deal with racial profiling in his own neighborhood. "Chief, I'm really sorry that happened to you," said Agent Maria Santos during their weekly briefing. "It's 2025 and people are still making these kinds of assumptions." David appreciated the support from his team, but he was also concerned about how the incident might affect his ability to work with local law enforcement. Building good relationships with police departments was crucial for FBI operations, and he didn't want this situation to create unnecessary tension. Captain Robert Hayes of the local police district called David personally Monday afternoon. "Chief Johnson, I wanted to apologize for what happened over the weekend. Officers Chen and Rodriguez filed a detailed report, and I've discussed the incident with my supervisors." "Captain Hayes, your officers handled the situation very professionally," David replied. "They responded appropriately to a citizen complaint and resolved it quickly once they had all the facts. I appreciate that, but I'm still concerned about the underlying issues here. We've been working hard to improve community relations, And this incident highlights some of the challenges we still face. David saw an opportunity to turn the negative experience into something positive. Actually, I've been thinking about that. Would you be interested in using this as a case study for training purposes? It might help officers understand how unconscious bias can affect citizen complaints. Captain Hayes was immediately interested. That's an excellent idea. Would you be willing to speak to our officers about your experience? Absolutely. I think honest conversations about these issues are the only way we're going to make real progress. Meanwhile, Linda was dealing with the social consequences of her actions. Her closest friend in the neighborhood, Beverly Chen, stopped by Tuesday evening with a concerned expression. "Linda, I've been hearing about what happened Saturday," Beverly said carefully. "People are talking and I wanted to make sure you're okay." Linda had been dreading this conversation. Beverly was one of the few Asian American residents in the neighborhood, and Linda worried that her actions might have damaged their friendship. "Beverly, I made a terrible mistake," Linda admitted. "I let my assumptions get the better of me and I'm ashamed of how I acted." Beverly sat down and looked at her friend seriously. "Linda, I've known you for 8 years and I know you're not a bad person. But what you did Saturday reflects some attitudes that a lot of us have experienced firsthand." The conversation was uncomfortable, but necessary. Beverly shared her own experiences of being questioned about her presence in upscale stores, or being asked where she was really from, despite being born in the United States. Linda listened with growing awareness of how her actions fit into a larger pattern of bias that affected many people of color. "I never realized," Linda said quietly. "I thought I was just being a responsible neighbor." The problem is that responsible often means different things when it comes to people who don't look like the majority, Beverly explained. David Johnson was doing exactly what you'd expect a new homeowner to do, but your first assumption was that he didn't belong there. Word of the incident eventually reached Rebecca Torres, the real estate agent who had handled David's house purchase. She felt partly responsible for not doing more to introduce David to the neighborhood when he moved in. Rebecca decided to organize a proper welcome gathering for David, sending invitations to all the Oakwood Drive residents. The event would serve multiple purposes: introducing David formally to his neighbors, showing community support after an embarrassing incident, and opening dialogue about inclusion and assumptions. David was initially reluctant to attend a gathering that felt like it was about him, but Tom convinced him it might be a good opportunity to build positive relationships going forward. "Look, Dave, you're going to be living in this neighborhood for years," Tom pointed out. "You can either stay isolated and let this incident define your relationship with these people, or you can engage and maybe help them become better neighbors." The welcome gathering was held the following Saturday at Janet Wu's house. About 20 neighbors attended, including Linda, who had spent the week agonizing over whether to show up. She ultimately decided that facing the situation directly was better than hiding from her mistake. David arrived with homemade barbecue sauce, a recipe he'd learned from his father. It was a small gesture, but it helped break the ice with neighbors who weren't sure how to approach him after hearing about Linda's mistake. The conversation was initially awkward, with people clearly avoiding direct mention of the previous weekend's incident. But as the afternoon progressed, neighbors began asking genuine questions about David's work and background. They learned that he'd grown up across town, had earned degrees in criminal justice and law, and had worked his way up through federal law enforcement over 15 years. Linda approached David near the end of the gathering. "Mr. Johnson, I want to thank you again for not pressing charges. I've spent this week thinking about what happened, and I realize I have a lot to learn about my own biases." David appreciated her directness. "Miss Patterson, I hope we can move forward as neighbors. But I also hope this experience helps you understand how quickly assumptions can escalate into serious situations." "It has," Linda said sincerely. "I've enrolled in a cultural sensitivity workshop downtown. I know it won't undo what happened, but I want to make sure I never make assumptions like that again." 3 months later, David had settled comfortably into the neighborhood routine. His automatic gate worked perfectly, and he'd completed several other home improvement projects. He'd developed friendly relationships with most of his neighbors, who had come to appreciate his quiet professionalism and occasional weekend barbecues. Linda kept her word about examining her biases. She completed the sensitivity training and became more active in community diversity initiatives. While she and David would never be close friends, They developed a respectful neighbor relationship based on mutual understanding of the lessons learned. From their first encounter, the incident became a case study not only for police training but also for neighborhood watch programs throughout the city. Captain Hayes and David co-presented workshops on recognizing unconscious bias in citizen reporting, helping other communities avoid similar situations. During one of these presentations, David reflected on how the incident had ultimately strengthened his resolve to build bridges between law, enforcement, and communities of color. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he told an audience of police officers and community leaders. "People of color face these assumptions regularly, regardless of their education, income, or profession. The difference is that my position gave me resources to address it constructively. The real tragedy isn't that one person made a mistake based on bias," he continued. "It's that these incidents happen every day to people who don't have the same platform to turn them into learning opportunities." 6 months after the gate incident, David was elected to the Homeowners Association Board. His first initiative was creating a new resident welcome program that would ensure future neighbors were properly introduced to the community when they moved in. Linda supported the program enthusiastically, having learned firsthand how assumptions and lack of communication could create unnecessary conflict. She volunteered to coordinate welcome visits, seeing it as a way to prevent other newcomers from experiencing what David had gone through. The program became a model for other neighborhoods, emphasizing the importance of building inclusive communities through intentional relationship building, rather than leaving introductions to chance. During the program's first year, Linda had the opportunity to welcome several new residents, including families from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Each interaction reminded her of the lesson she'd learned the hard way, that assumptions based on appearance could lead to serious misjudgments about people's character and intentions. The automatic gate that had started the whole controversy became something of a neighborhood landmark. Children would wave at David as he came and went, and he'd programmed it to respond with a cheerful beep. It served as a daily reminder that security and community inclusion weren't mutually exclusive. Goals. David's story eventually made its way into FBI training materials as an example of how agents might face bias in their personal lives, regardless of their professional status. It helped new agents understand that wearing a badge didn't make them immune to the prejudices that affected other people of color in American society. Years later, when David was promoted to a regional director position, he would often tell new agents that his most important lesson in leadership hadn't come from a case file or training manual. It had come from a Saturday afternoon spent installing a gate while a neighbor watched from her window, making assumptions that said more about society's biases than about his right to be in his own driveway. The story of that day became a powerful reminder that building trust in communities required more than good intentions. It required honest conversations about bias, willingness to admit mistakes, and commitment to treating all people with dignity, regardless of whether they fit our expectations about who belongs where.